If an avoidant is on your mind every day, these 5 things are actually happening to them, and the strange part is that while you're sitting there replaying moments, rereading messages, and trying to understand what shifted between you, their internal world is not the continuous emotional stream you imagine. It works in fragments, in pauses, in sudden interruptions that don't follow your timeline at all. And that mismatch is exactly why this situation feels so confusing, almost like two people are living inside completely different versions of the same story. You keep thinking presence means constant thinking, constant missing, constant emotional echoing, but for them, it doesn't work like a background song that never stops playing. It comes in flashes, triggered by something small, something random, something that looks meaningless on the outside but hits something deeper underneath. And if you stay with this, you'll start to see why silence from them is not emptiness, and why thinking about them every day doesn't automatically mean they're experiencing the same intensity. Before we go deeper into that, if you're someone who finds yourself constantly trying to decode avoidant behavior, you might as well subscribe because, let's be honest, you've probably already done more emotional analysis on this situation than most people do in a year. And here, we don't just romanticize it, we actually break it down so it makes sense. Now, the first thing happening inside them when you're on their mind is not longing, not nostalgia, not immediate emotional confession. It is suppression kicking in almost automatically. The moment your image, your memory, or even a subtle reminder of you surfaces, their internal system doesn't lean into it. It reacts against it. It's like a reflex they don't consciously choose, where emotional activation is quickly met with emotional shutdown. This is not because they feel nothing, but because feeling something strongly without a clear way to process it has historically felt unsafe for them. So instead of sitting with the emotion, they compress it, push it down, redirect it, distract from it. On the outside, nothing seems to happen, but internally there is a quiet interruption, a brief spike of awareness followed by immediate containment. And this is where most people misunderstand avoidance completely. They assume absence of reaction means absence of feeling, when in reality it often means feeling something and immediately locking it away before it grows too large. So while you might be thinking about them in an open, flowing emotional way, their first response is often the opposite. Contraction, not expansion. The second thing that starts happening is something far more confusing even for them, and that is the internal conflict between missing you and wanting distance from you at the same time. This is not a clean emotional state. It is not one feeling replacing another. It is two opposing impulses existing side by side without resolution. One part of them can recognize your absence and feel a quiet pull toward you, a sense of familiarity, connection, even warmth tied to memory. But another part immediately responds with caution, reminding them of emotional intensity, responsibility, expectations, or the feeling of being overwhelmed that may have existed in the dynamic. So instead of moving toward clarity, they get stuck in oscillation. They think of you and something soft appears, then something defensive follows right after it. And because the nervous system hates unresolved tension, their mind often chooses the path of least pressure, which is not deeper engagement but emotional stepping back. This is why you can exist strongly in their mind one moment and feel completely inaccessible the next. It's not inconsistency in memory, it's inconsistency in emotional tolerance. And then comes something even more subtle. The third thing, they don't remember you as one stable version of yourself. Their memory of you is reconstructed in emotional snapshots, not a continuous narrative. There's the version of you from calm moments, the version of you from emotional moments, the version of you from conflict, the version of you from closeness, and all of these can exist separately in their mind without blending into one cohesive image. So depending on what triggered the memory, they may feel completely different emotional responses toward you. One moment you are warmth and safety, another moment you are pressure or intensity, not because you changed, but because their memory is tied to emotional states rather than consistent identity. This is also why avoidants can sometimes seem confusingly mixed in their responses after separation or distance. They are not reacting to who you are as a full person in real time. They are reacting to fragments stored in emotional context. And when those fragments get triggered, their reaction depends entirely on which version of the memory surfaced, not on a stable conclusion about the relationship itself. The fourth thing happening is something they rarely admit even to themselves. Silence does not mean peace. On the surface, it may look like distance brings calm, like stepping away creates clarity, like no contact means emotional reset. But internally, unresolved emotional material doesn't simply disappear because interaction stops. It often lingers beneath awareness, processed in delayed and indirect ways. So while you might assume that absence has made them forget, what often happens instead is that the mind revisits fragments of the connection in quieter moments, not as active engagement but as background processing that surfaces when distractions fade. This is why avoidants can appear completely fine during busy periods, yet experience unexpected emotional waves in stillness. Not dramatic outbursts, not obvious longing, but subtle resurfacing of emotional residue that was never fully integrated in the first place. And because they are skilled at functioning without expressing these internal experiences outwardly, nobody around them sees this happening, which reinforces the illusion that nothing is going on inside at all. And that leads into the fifth thing, which is one of the most unpredictable parts of their emotional world: delayed emotional processing that arrives without warning. While you may assume emotions are experienced in real time, avoidants often process meaning after distance has already been created. So a conversation, a moment, or even a breakup may not fully register emotionally until much later, when the immediate intensity has passed and their system feels safe enough to revisit it. This is where sudden waves of memory, reflection, or emotional awareness can appear out of nowhere, not because something new happened, but because something old finally reached processing depth. And the strange part is that these moments don't always lead to action. Feeling something deeply does not automatically translate into reaching out or reconnecting. Instead, it often stays internal, absorbed, and compartmentalized again. So from your perspective, it can feel like silence equals indifference, when in reality the emotional experience may be far more complex, just unfolding on a different timeline entirely. And once you understand that delay in emotional processing, something even more unsettling starts to make sense. The way they appear completely fine while internally carrying contradictions they never fully express. On the outside, their life continues almost unchanged, routines intact, conversations normal, energy seemingly stable, and that creates a powerful illusion for anyone watching from the outside that nothing deeper is happening beneath the surface. But internally, it's not absence of emotion, it's compartmentalization. They don't experience everything as one continuous emotional wave. Instead, they separate, isolate, and file away experiences in different mental folders, only accessing them when something randomly unlocks that space. That's why they can seem unaffected in one moment and unexpectedly reflective in another, almost like two different versions of them exist depending on what their mind decides to open. And this disconnect is exactly what makes them so hard to read, because people assume emotional truth must always be visible, but in their case, emotional truth is often hidden beneath functional behavior. They are not necessarily calm because they feel nothing. They are calm because they have learned how to function without fully processing everything at once. That internal compartmentalization naturally leads into something that happens next without them even realizing it: the rewriting of emotional narratives. When emotional intensity becomes uncomfortable or overwhelming, the mind doesn't always hold on to the raw version of events. It starts reshaping them into something more manageable. Not in a dishonest way, but in a protective way. The relationship begins to get reframed in hindsight, where moments of closeness may be remembered alongside moments of pressure, and moments of love may be remembered alongside moments of emotional demand. Over time, this blending creates a softer internal justification for distance, where stepping back doesn't feel like abandonment but like necessity. This is how they maintain internal balance. Because if every emotionally intense memory remained unfiltered, it would create too much internal conflict. So instead, the mind subtly edits, not erasing what happened, but reorganizing it into a version that feels easier to carry. And from your perspective, this can feel like revisionism or emotional rewriting of history, but from theirs, it is often the only way they can make sense of staying regulated. They are not trying to deny what existed. They are trying to make what existed emotionally survivable inside their own system. And within that rewriting process, something more emotionally complex quietly develops: guilt that rarely becomes visible. Most people assume avoidants feel less, but that is not accurate. They often feel deeply but struggle to express or resolve what they feel in real time. So even when they have created distance, even when they appear detached, even when they have convinced themselves that stepping away was necessary, there can still be moments where guilt surfaces unexpectedly. Not always guilt in a dramatic or expressive sense, but a quiet awareness that something meaningful was lost, or that someone was affected in ways they did not fully engage with in the moment. The reason this guilt doesn't often turn into action is because action would require reopening emotional intensity they are actively trying to regulate. So instead, guilt becomes another internal fragment, acknowledged briefly, then contained again. This is part of the reason why avoidants can seem emotionally inconsistent from the outside. It's not that they don't care, it's that caring does not always translate into movement. They can recognize emotional impact without feeling capable of stepping back into the environment that produced it. And just when it seems like their internal world is entirely about suppression and distancing, there is another layer that contradicts that assumption entirely: sudden emotional waves that appear without warning. These are not constant, and they are not predictable, but they are very real. A song, a place, a phrase, a specific moment of quiet, something small can bypass their defenses and bring a flood of emotional memory to the surface. And what makes this so confusing is that these moments don't always match their conscious narrative. They can be in a phase of emotional detachment, fully convinced they are fine, and then suddenly feel a wave of familiarity, connection, or emotional heaviness that doesn't align with their current stance. But because avoidants are skilled at compartmentalizing, these waves rarely lead to immediate expression. Instead, they are often experienced internally and then quickly contained again, almost like a system resetting itself after a brief disruption. From your perspective, you might interpret their silence as emotional absence, but internally there may have been entire emotional sequences you never saw, processed privately and then locked away again before they ever had the chance to influence behavior. And that naturally brings us to one of the most misunderstood parts of all this: why they don't reach out even when you are clearly on their mind. This is where emotional experience and behavioral response completely split apart. People assume that thinking about someone should naturally lead to contact, but for them, thought does not equal action in the same way. Instead, thought often activates a second layer of awareness: consequences. If they reach out, what does that reopen emotionally? What expectations does that create? What vulnerability does that expose? What emotional responsibility does that bring back into motion? So even if there is genuine memory, even if there is emotional activation, even if there is curiosity or longing, it often collides with a protective system that prioritizes stability over expression. And in that moment, non-action becomes the default. Not because the feeling isn't real, but because acting on it feels like re-entering emotional complexity they have already learned to regulate by stepping away. This is why so many situations remain unresolved from your side. You are waiting for emotional alignment to produce action, while they are experiencing emotional activation that does not automatically translate into engagement. And that gap between feeling and action is where most confusion lives. And once you understand that gap between feeling and action, the next layer becomes even more revealing, because it explains something that often hurts the most: the internal push-pull cycle that exists inside them without anyone else ever seeing it directly. From the outside, it can look like inconsistency or mixed signals, but internally it is more like two systems constantly negotiating with each other in real time. One system responds to emotional connection with recognition, familiarity, even a subtle pull toward closeness, while the other system immediately evaluates risk, vulnerability, expectation, and emotional exposure. So what happens is not a simple decision, but a rapid internal back and forth where both sides attempt to protect the person in different ways. One part leans in, the other pulls back, and the final outcome is often distance, not because connection wasn't felt, but because distance temporarily reduces internal tension, and this is why interactions with them can feel so unpredictable. You are often only seeing the final output of a much deeper internal negotiation that you were never part of. It is not that they are playing games or intentionally sending mixed signals. It is that their internal emotional architecture is built around managing intensity rather than sustaining it continuously. That internal cycle also explains something that feels deeply personal to many people: the way their emotional responses seem to reset after moments of closeness. There can be a moment of connection, vulnerability, even warmth that feels meaningful and real, and then shortly after, a noticeable shift where they appear distant or emotionally neutral again. To the person on the receiving end, this can feel confusing or even painful, as if the connection didn't matter as much as it seemed in the moment. But internally, what is often happening is not erasure of emotion, but containment of it. The moment intensity rises beyond a certain threshold, the system attempts to stabilize itself by reducing emotional exposure. So instead of staying in the heightened state, they transition back into familiarity, routine, or emotional distance, not because the connection was false, but because sustained intensity feels unsustainable to their regulation system. This is why closeness with them often feels like something that appears and disappears in cycles rather than something that steadily builds. It's not a reflection of your value or the significance of the bond, it's a reflection of how they process emotional peaks. And then something even more subtle happens that most people never consider. When thinking about you turns into avoidance again. This is one of the most paradoxical aspects of their emotional world. A memory appears, a feeling surfaces, or a moment of reflection begins, and for a brief second there is openness, awareness, even emotional presence, but if that emotional activation starts to feel too strong, too unresolved, or too exposed, the system quickly shifts direction. The same memory that created warmth can suddenly become a trigger for withdrawal, not because the memory changed, but because the emotional load attached to it crossed a threshold. So instead of staying with it, they redirect attention, distract, move into activity, or emotionally disengage again. This creates a loop where emotional proximity automatically triggers protective distance. And from the outside, this can feel like contradiction, but internally it is actually consistency, a consistent effort to maintain emotional regulation. The result is a pattern where they can think about you frequently, even deeply, but rarely stay in that emotional space long enough for it to translate into visible action or sustained engagement. And this leads directly into one of the most important misunderstandings in all of this: the assumption that thinking about someone equals missing them in the way you experience missing someone. For most people, missing someone is a continuous emotional presence, a steady awareness of absence that builds connection and desire for closeness. But for them, missing someone can be fragmented, intermittent, and layered with other emotional responses that interrupt it. So yes, they can think about you, but that thought may be accompanied by comfort, discomfort, curiosity, resistance, nostalgia, or even emotional fatigue depending on the context in which it arises. This means the experience is not always unified into a single feeling like, "I miss you." Instead, it can be a combination of emotional fragments that don't always resolve into action. So when someone assumes that because they are thinking about them constantly, the other person must be experiencing the same intensity of longing, it creates a mismatch in expectations. The truth is not that they feel nothing. It is that their emotional experience is less linear and less consolidated than what most people expect from attachment. And finally, when all of this is seen together, a deeper realization begins to form. Emotional experience and relational outcome are not always directly aligned. Just because someone occupies your thoughts every day does not mean they are experiencing the same frequency, structure, or intensity of thought about you. And just because someone is thinking about you does not mean that those thoughts will transform into action, clarity, or reconnection. Between emotion and behavior lies a complex system of internal regulation, protection, memory processing, and fear management that most people never see. And that is why this situation feels so one-sided from the inside looking out. It is not that your experience is invalid, it is that the internal reality of the other person operates on a different rhythm entirely. And once you begin to understand that difference, the obsession starts to loosen its grip slightly, because confusion is often fueled by assuming both people are experiencing the same emotional architecture when, in reality, they are not. And once that realization settles in, something even deeper starts to surface, because the real shift is not just understanding how differently they process emotion, but recognizing how much meaning gets lost when you try to interpret their inner world through your own emotional system. You start to see that a lot of the pain comes not only from what happened between you, but from the expectation that emotional connection should behave in a predictable, shared rhythm. When it doesn't, the mind fills in the gaps with assumptions of indifference, assumptions of replacement, assumptions of emotional erasure. But what you're actually dealing with is a system where emotional presence doesn't guarantee emotional expression, and emotional expression doesn't guarantee emotional action. That mismatch creates a constant sense of uncertainty, where absence feels louder than it actually is, and silence gets interpreted as finality even when internal processing is still ongoing in ways you can't observe. And this is where most people unknowingly create their own emotional suffering. Not because they are wrong to feel, but because they are trying to translate a different psychological language using only their own vocabulary. And in that space between interpretation and reality, another pattern becomes visible. The way emotional distance often gets mistaken for emotional resolution. When someone pulls away, stops engaging, or becomes less responsive, the natural assumption is that the emotional story has ended. But for them, distance is not always closure. Sometimes it is regulation, sometimes it is pause, sometimes it is an attempt to stabilize internal emotional overload without fully processing what caused it. So while you might experience distance as a conclusion, internally it can be more like a holding pattern where emotions are still present but intentionally kept out of active awareness to maintain functionality. This is why time alone does not always produce clarity in the way people expect. Instead of resolving feelings, time can sometimes simply reduce their intensity enough to make them easier to ignore, and when that happens, the emotional narrative doesn't disappear, it just becomes quieter, buried under routine, distraction, and the return of everyday life. From your perspective, it looks like they have moved on. From their perspective, it may simply feel like they have stopped engaging with something that once felt too emotionally complex to hold continuously. That's also why moments of unexpected reflection can feel so disorienting for them. A random memory, a familiar place, or even a small sensory trigger can temporarily disrupt the distance they have built. In those moments, the emotional narrative doesn't feel distant at all. It can feel immediate again, almost like it is happening in real time inside their mind. But because their system is built around managing intensity, those moments rarely stay open for long. The mind quickly moves to contain them again, not necessarily by rejecting the emotion, but by redirecting attention away from it before it expands. This creates a pattern where emotional truth appears in brief flashes rather than sustained awareness, which makes it extremely difficult for anyone on the outside to track what is actually happening internally. You might assume that consistency of feeling should lead to consistency of action, but in their case, emotional consistency is interrupted not by lack of depth, but by fear of overwhelm. And so what you are left seeing is only fragments, moments without continuity, signals without follow-through, presence without persistence. And this brings everything back to a central truth that most people only recognize after stepping back from the emotional intensity of the situation. You were never actually responding to the same version of reality. While you were building emotional continuity through memory, attachment, meaning, and shared experience, they were often experiencing those same moments in isolated emotional segments that did not automatically connect into one linear story. That difference alone changes everything. Because when one person experiences love as a continuous thread and the other experiences it as separate emotional snapshots, the interpretation of what happened will always diverge. One person feels a story that still lives in them. The other feels moments that rise and fall depending on internal state, and neither experience cancels out the other, but they do explain why closure, understanding, and emotional alignment often feel so difficult to reach in these dynamics. And finally, when all five of these realities are understood together, something quietly transformative happens in the way you see the entire situation. The constant need to decode, to analyze, to replay, to search for hidden meaning starts to lose its grip, not because the emotions disappear, but because the confusion begins to resolve into structure. You start to understand that thinking about someone every day does not guarantee shared emotional experience. You start to understand that silence is not a clean signal of indifference, but often a complex mix of internal regulation, protection, and delayed processing. And most importantly, you begin to see that what you were interpreting as a single emotional truth was actually two completely different psychological systems moving in parallel without fully aligning. And when that realization lands fully, the question slowly shifts. It is no longer about what they are secretly feeling or thinking at any given moment, but about whether you want to keep measuring your emotional reality through a system that was never designed to mirror yours in the first place.